Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Josh McCullough. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Meet Your 2020 Anti-Harassment Training Requirements. We are excited to have Jill Albrecht with us today, and she has a great presentation for us with a ton of information. And I'm going to turn it over to Jill here in just a minute so we can start diving in. If we can go ahead and go to the next slide, we'll cover the basic kind of webinar 101 things. There we go. Perfect. So we are going to do a couple polls. We're going to kick things off with the polls. So we appreciate your participation in those polls. And you will be sent the slides and the recording after the webinar. Give us about 24 to 48 hours to get that to you by email. And then we do have a large audience with us today, but we encourage your questions. We'll do our best to pick off some of the questions. Can't make any promises because we just have a packed hour of information, but we'll try to reserve some time to at least go over some very common FAQs and maybe pick off some questions that are coming in through the questions widget in Zoom. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and do a couple of polls here. I'm going to launch the first poll, and this one's just kind of about the webinar topic. So we want to make sure that we're listening to businesses on what is most helpful. So the question here is, what topics are you most interested in learning about in future webinars? You can select all that apply here through a few concepts out here. Policies and handbooks, we've seen a lot of interest, a lot of questions and challenges with that in 2020. Harassment and discrimination prevention, obviously something we're about to dive into today. Wage and compensation, and then compliance priorities for 2020 and 2021. So we'll let this go for just a second. We're at 42%. Let's try to get up close to 60%. Really appreciate you participating here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull it down. We just hit 50%. I'm going to share the results here. So interesting. I think the high level compliance priorities for 2020 and 2021, followed by policies and handbooks, and then harassment and discrimination prevention. So looks like a big chunk of you, 55% said harassment and discrimination prevention. So you're in the right place. Excited that you're with us today. I'm going to pull this one down. We're going to do one more quick poll, and then we will send it over to Jill for today's content. So I'm launching this one. Will you be incorporating new payroll, HR products, or services into your business? I think it's within the next year. It's cut off on my screen. So we'll let this one go for just a second. I know we often have people that hop in a couple minutes after the top of the hour. So I'll remind you, we will be sending the recording. We'll be sending the slides your way. Give us 24 to 48 hours to do that. And then as we get into today's content, we welcome your questions. We'll try to pick off a few and address them if there is time. Okay. Good deal. So I'm going to end this poll. And with that, I am going to go ahead and let's go to the next slide. Excuse me. I want to talk a little bit about today's presenter, Jill Albrecht, attorney, compliance subject matter expert. She's done a lot of work with harassment prevention, compliance training programs, and I'm sure Jill may want to share a little bit about her background herself, but we're excited to have Jill here, a wealth of knowledge on the topic. So Jill, take it away.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for the introduction. As Josh mentioned, I am a labor and employment lawyer by trade. I've worked for outside law firms as in-house counsel. I've worked as a consultant helping companies build compliance training programs. I do a lot of presenting on this topic. So I'm really excited to be here today and walk through our current training mandates, talk a little bit about what we think is coming down the line in terms of what's next in this space from a compliance mandate for anti-harassment training on a state-by-state basis, and then also talk a little bit about some of the other requirements that come along with these training mandates that are less, I think, sort of popular to talk about, but every bit as important from a compliance perspective, and sometimes even a little bit more complicated to meet those mandates. So there's a bunch of information today. I'm glad that you all have access to the slides here. Some of them are designed to be reference material and not, I promise I won't read the slides directly, but I will get started and dive in here to the state mandates. as I mentioned, training is sort of the topic that gets the most press, but there's often also requirements relative to policies that an employer must have, agreement restrictions, posters that they have to disseminate, and all kinds of other tricky little nuances that make compliance with these anti-harassment mandates really challenging. So you'll see today we'll have a few questions at the end where we talk about the frequently asked questions, but please also, as Josh mentioned, we'll try to do our best to answer your questions as well. So just a quick, if you are new to this space or still trying to wrap your head around it, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on sort of how we got here. So obviously the Me Too movement was the revolution from a employer-employee standpoint that really thrust into the limelight the requirements that employers have for their employees and training them, what workplace culture looks like, what the expectations are on each side. And prior to 2018, there were only 3 states that had a specific requirement for training in this space. And so for any other organization that wanted to provide anti-harassment or anti-discrimination training, it was a sort of voluntary event that looks a lot different than what is required by these state mandates. And so there's the Me Too movement happens in late 2018. And since then, we've seen an expansion from those states that were sort of first in line in terms of having training mandates, and a bunch of other states that have come along and passed, sometimes in certain cases, multiple laws requiring employers to do various different things in order to create a workplace free from harassment. And so we've, of course, seen a uptick in EEOC sexual harassment charges. This slide is just EEOC charges, so it's not, New York State or California state charges. It's just the federal EEOC. And, we continue to see this rise even during COVID, which we weren't really sure, I think, from, what's the trend going to look like, and whatever in-person harassment that has sort of taken a downslide. We've seen a lot of complaints come through related to harassment that is taking place online or via video. And so definitely not something that is going away anytime soon. If you're working with an organization that is a sort of money or budget focused organization, this is a good slide, I think, to keep in your back pocket, because we have just seen a massive jump in the amount of money that is being utilized in order to settle these cases and being sort of devoted to resolving the cases, whether that's in legal fees or additional training or what have you. And so it's really important that, an organization pay attention to this particular area, because there's not only a lot of, I think, PR focus on these issues for employers, but also, as I've mentioned, a lot of different tentacles to comply with. And so we're going to talk about all of those right now. So this is a good map of the current states where there are anti-harassment training laws. Now, this may not look like a ton. The interesting thing that we'll talk a bit about, because the more and more laws that are passed and the more states that get added to this list, we're seeing this sort of bleed into the expectation that even if you're not required to provide the training, you need to give the training. You need to, as an employer, train your employees on what is the appropriate workplace conduct, and be very vocal as an employer that harassment will not be tolerated in the workplace. And sort of taking the position as an organization that, I wasn't required to train my employees, is becoming less and less persuasive. And so I would say that it's absolutely a best practice that even if you're in a state that doesn't have a training mandate, that you are still training your employees. The sort of nice thing about doing it voluntarily is that you're not beholden to quite the same number of requirements, right? And timing restrictions and all of the layers of complexity that these states on the map have to them. But it's definitely, a sort of all encompassing, not just the training itself, but also wanting to be thoughtful about your policies, wanting to be thoughtful about what's included in your handbook, thinking about what's disseminated to your employees via email or posted on the intranet or in the break room. And so, big wind up to then take a deep dive into these states and what the current training mandates are. So California, not surprisingly, is one of the most active states in this area. It's one of the first states that had a training requirement for its employees. And of course, since the Me Too movement, it has taken multiple chances to expand its law relative to anti-harassment and has created a lot of very specific compliance requirements for employers that operate in that state. So it applies to employers with 5 or more employees. That's regardless of where they're located. So if you have most of your population in Texas, but you have 1 employee in California, you need to train the employee in California in a way that is compliant with the California law. The state of California takes the position that all employees need to be trained. And that includes all different kinds of categories of individuals. So some part-time, unpaid interns, volunteers, independent contractors, all of the folks who are performing services and working together with your company need to be trained. There's a 1-hour mandate for employees, and you'll see in a couple of different states where there's an added layer of expectation of training and requirement for supervisors. One of the reasons why I think this is really important, and also would recommend, even again, if you're not in a state that has a requirement that you provide training to your supervisors, is that supervisors will bind the company for liability with their actions. And so if an employee reports to a manager that they've been exposed to sexual harassment in the workplace and complains to that manager, and the manager doesn't know how to handle it, so they don't do anything, or they don't know how to handle it in the right and appropriate way, and so they do something that it either exacerbates the issue or otherwise complicates it, then the entire organization or company will be on the hook for that conduct of the manager, because they are in a management position and sort of speaking or operating on behalf of the company. So really important, I think, to take the time to train the managers on not only, yes, anti-harassment, harassment-free workplace, but also so that they understand what their obligations are as managers and what sort of power they hold and the responsibility that they have on this topic. One of the other things you'll see repeated with each state, which of course there's very little continuity from a state by state. They didn't coordinate very well together. So there's all kinds of different moving parts, and they're just different enough to keep this really complicated and interesting. But the last part that you'll see in a lot of the states is that there is a very specific content requirement. And so when you're training employees or offering training, it's not enough to just, here's an anti-harassment training, it covers X, Y, and Z topics, and it tells everybody that we will not tolerate harassment in the workplace, and that's good enough. And unfortunately, it's not in a state where you have a training mandate, because there are in each state very specific content requirements. So the definition of harassment under that state's law, the FEHA provisions, for example, in California, are required to be noted within the training. Examples of prohibited conduct are required in California, and that may not be required in another state. And so, unfortunately, it's not enough to just offer a training on the topic, and you need to make sure that it is meeting those specific requirements. There's been an extension for compliance under certain circumstances to the end of 2020. So January 1, the new deadline takes effect. So if you have not trained employees in 2019, or you trained your employees in 2018, they didn't need to be trained in 19, they would need to be retrained. 2019 trainees don't need to be retrained until 2021. But this is just a slide, I think, to illustrate that the requirement is every 2 years, but it's very much a revolving door depending on when the employee was hired, when they were promoted to supervisor, if that was the case. Even if they had been trained as an employee but then get promoted to supervisor, they need to be retrained on that particular topic. And so I know a lot of companies that I've worked with used to approach this on sort of an anniversary or event-based date. So every spring we do our anti-harassment training. And because everybody has a different deadline or date wherein they would need to be retrained, you can no longer offer that type of just, we'll do it once a year on this date and we'll catch everybody in the net at that time. And that's not going to work for that reason and another reason that we'll talk about in a little bit. So finding an option that really allows you to deploy the training whenever you need to, and keeping track of when you need to deploy that training is really important for states that have these types of mandates. So New York State did not want to be outdone by California, even though it was playing a little bit of catch up, but it did come and bring with force a compliance mandate for employers that is sort of bigger and enlarged from a compliance requirement perspective from California, believe it or not. So it's all employers. There's no employee threshold, regardless of size. All employees, managers, and employees. This training in New York needs to be offered annually. So for other types of training that need to be provided on an annual basis, you know how challenging this is to work with deploying that training in that manner, again, needing to make it sort of on a revolving basis available as new people are being hired or promoted, to make sure that they are getting that training on an annual basis. There's specific requirements for the content itself. There is a poster requirement in New York, meaning that there needs to be a specific posting setting forth specific content that has in New York State's anti-harassment law and how to seek assistance if you're an employee who's being exposed to harassment in the workplace. New York State has a training content requirement that requires that the training include what the employee's rights are and what their remedies are, meaning what can they do if they feel like they're being harassed, and how do they seek outside help, and what kind of help can they get, whether it's monetary or other types of damages. So one of the things I wanted to call out for New York that is a nuance for each state, but New York specifically requires that new employees should be trained ASAP. Some other states will say within 90 days or within the first 6 months. And going back to the best practice perspective, I think even if it's not required that you do it ASAP, you should do it ASAP, and here's why. The defense mechanism that an employer has once they've trained an employee and given the employee the tools to understand what's appropriate in the workplace, what's not appropriate in the workplace, and then also, you know, how to report or how to reach out to their managers, what they need to do. That is a really powerful tool in the event that they do have an issue from a litigation perspective, to show the court or the arbitrator or the auditor that we, you know, took steps in order to communicate our position that harassment was not going to be tolerated in the workplace. And the person who engaged in this conduct that is being complained about went outside of the policy. They broke our policy. But we did what we could in order to prevent it. So again, you don't want to be caught in a situation where somebody gets hired, they don't get trained until, you know, the first 90 days, if you're in a state where that's the type of requirement. And unfortunately, something happens within that 90-day time frame. And the employer is then forced to explain, well, you know, I had 90 days to do it, or I didn't do it right away. And so I sort of left this pocket of exposure for the organization. So by doing it right away, by doing it as a part of the onboarding training or ASAP as it's required in New York, really does put the employer in the best place possible from a defense perspective. And I think starts off every employee with setting the bar for what the expectations are relative to anti-harassment. So really important from a best practice perspective, if not required. Just to keep things interesting, New York City went ahead and passed its own law. So if you have employers who are have employees who are working in New York City, which is obviously in New York, you need to comply with both, which sounds very challenging, and it is, because of course the laws don't completely align with one another. New York City has a threshold, so if you have 15 or more employees, you need to adhere to the New York City law. The one, I think, interesting call out here, it's also additional or annual training requirement. Here, as I just discussed, new employees must be trained within 90 days, but again, I would consider a best practice to just do it as a part of the onboarding training. One call out for New York City that I think is really interesting is the inclusion of having to include the bystander intervention topic as a part of the training. So bystander intervention must be covered. And if you aren't familiar with the concept of bystander intervention, it's something that I think really gained popularity coming out of the Me Too movement. is a part of a shift from the training that used to happen, as we talked about. Maybe we talk once a year about workplace harassment and how we prevent it from happening. But I think a lot of those trainings spoke to the sort of bad eggs in the group. Here's how you should treat one another, and don't do X, Y, and Z. Don't rub your coworkers' shoulders, right? Don't make sexually explicit comments in the office. And it was all sort of targeted at like the bad actors. And what we realized, I think, coming out of the Me Too movement is that just doesn't work. It doesn't resonate with most employees because thankfully most employees aren't those bad actors. And so there's this sort of feeling that you're talking not to me, you're talking to this other group. And so I can kind of check out of this process. And what the studies have shown, and what I think we've learned as our own trainings have evolved, is that the much better approach is to talk about how we're all in this together. It's up to everybody in the workplace to ensure that we get to come to work in a workplace free from harassment. And so if I'm a bystander and I witness something happening that I know to be inappropriate or against policy or something that would qualify as harassment, that I should feel empowered to speak up and to intervene if I feel comfortable or it's appropriate, and if not in that moment, to talk to the person later to say, hey, I saw that happen, or I heard those comments that were being made. Can I support you as we, go to HR to make a report? How can I, be helpful as we try to resolve this? And so whether it's in the moment or after the fact, intervening to be a part of the process that says this is not okay and we need to stop it and we need to prevent it from happening in the future. So this is definitely something that's picking up a lot of steam. I think that we'll probably be seeing more requirements for bystander intervention in the states that are enacting new laws, but definitely one of the nuances for New York City specifically. Illinois is another state that has a really robust anti-harassment mandate for employers. The Workplace Transparency Act was enacted back in August of 2019. There's a January 1, 2020 deadline for annual training for everybody in in Illinois. All employees, all independent contractors are not specifically required, but they are strongly advised. Again, from a best practice perspective, even though the specific requirement doesn't extend to independent contractors, if you do have contractors or consultants in your workplace, it is, I think, important to offer the training to them and consider making that training a requirement to performing services for the organization. Because the reality of it is you may end up having a situation that involves a contractor, and again, having the sort of parachute that there was a training offered, that this person participated in it, can be really helpful from a defense perspective in shielding the company from certain liabilities. All trainings must be trained, all new hires must be trained as soon as possible. One of the nuances that we see here in Illinois that pops up in a couple of different states is that there is a record keeping requirement. And so not only do you have to provide the training and make sure everybody takes it, but you also have to keep a record of that training that may be requested by the Illinois Department of Human Rights, which could conduct an audit to say, are you making this training available, and are you making sure that everybody takes it and completes it? And so again, working with a partner that will allow you the opportunity to sort of take that piece off of the plate of your plate and keep track of who's taking the training and who's completing it, and then hold on to those records. So in the event a year or two from now, there's a audit and you need to present those records, that you have them available. One of the specific content requirements for Illinois that I think is really interesting is that they've been very prescriptive about the type of content that needs to be included in the training related to the investigation of specific allegations of harassment. And so in the training needs to describe what investigations look like, how the process works, what corrective measures could come out of those investigations. And so sort of nuanced, different than other states, but again, just to show you the moving parts in each state and how they may differ from one to the other. Delaware has a, small states, small mandate, 50 or more employees within the state. So Delaware is the only state that has the requirement of the employee number threshold, making sure that those employees are within the state and not counting sort of if you have 50 people in Texas and one person in Delaware, you wouldn't need to comply to the state. So every 2-year requirement, a sort of smaller group of people who need to be trained under the law. But again, certainly in a state where you have a training mandate, if you have to go through the process to offer the training at all, as a best practice, I think it's recommended that all folks who will be in the workplace and interacting with one another get that training so that, everybody understands what the expectations are in that workplace related to anti-harassment. Additional training for supervisors is required in Delaware. Same logic applies. If you're providing the additional training for supervisors in Delaware, think about maybe other states that don't have a requirement and offering that training to all supervisors, again, because that attachment of liability that supervisors can bring to the organization applies everywhere. Maine has an employee threshold. They are one of the oldest anti-harassment requirement mandates that was updated in 2018 as a part of the Me Too movement. All employees must be trained. You only have to train them one time. You do need to update to the extent the laws change. And so I think only training folks one time is a little bit of a misnomer, because if the laws change or they are updated, an updated training will need to be given in Maine. Connecticut recently updated its laws on this topic and passed the Time's Up Act, which was enacted on June 18 of 2019. There's a certain requirements that apply to very small employers, 3 employees or less, managers only. Employers with 3 or more employees must provide the training to everybody. There's a specific 2-hour length of requirement for training. And there's a deadline coming up on October 1 of 2020. So to the extent any employers are not currently complying or not thinking about whether or not they need to comply in Connecticut, this is a really good chance to think about what we need to do in the next couple of weeks. New employees here must be trained within 6 months. I've said it a couple of times, I won't say it again, but definitely best practice, do it ASAP. And there are notice, posting, and interactivity requirements for Connecticut. And interactivity is a word that's been on a couple of slides, and that's a component to most of the new anti-harassment laws, wherein it's, I may be showing my age, but if anybody had the experience of a middle school or high school video day where the teacher would roll in the cart with a TV and a VCR and play a video, that's not sufficient for anti-harassment training, or maybe anything other than putting a bunch of kids to sleep. But this is a opportunity to get the employee to engage and be thoughtful, and there needs to, in most states, be some component of interactivity with the platform that you're using. Washington State is one of the newer, most recent states to have a compliance mandate relative to anti-harassment. It is limited to certain industries, so it only applies to employers of more than 1 employee in retail, hotel, motel, security, or property services. So if you think of industries or companies wherein their employees are being exposed to the general public, is I think one way to think of it. It's an annual training requirement for just those industries. There is a list of resources that is required to be provided to employees that they can utilize for reportings. And this is an interesting component for me, because when you think about employer obligations, handing an employee a list of here's how you report an issue externally is a really scary thing. And so being very thoughtful about, if we are including this type of content in our training requirements, let's also think about what our own internal process looks like. And perhaps this is an opportunity to also provide information about what's possible internally, so that hopefully employees are utilizing those internal resources before they're seeking external assistance from a plaintiff's lawyer or an outside agency. There's some deadlines coming up. There's a deadline for very large hotels or motels, but now the deadline for all others in those industries is coming up on January 1. Washington, D.C. has a unique law. It's called the Tipped Wage Worker Fairness Amendment Act, which, as it describes, it applies to workers who receive tips. And so it's sort of limited to restaurants and types of organizations where tips are received, but it doesn't just limit itself to those tipped employees. Managers, operators, and owners must be trained, which is a little different. It's the only requirement that has that enlargement for owners and operators, in addition to the employees themselves and the managers. The training has some specific content requirements. The asterisk that belongs on for Washington, D.C. is that the deadline itself of when it will go into effect is to be decided because it has not yet received budget funding. We, every sort of couple of months hear, oh, it's going to get funded, it's going to get funded. And sometimes they'll float a date, or, you know, I heard January and then I heard July and still nothing. And so as you can see, this was passed in 2018. So it's been awaiting budget funding for a while. So it's hard to say what's going to happen at this point, but definitely something that you want to have on your radar to the extent this is the industry in which the employer is working. Oregon does not have a training component requirement, but it has a Workplace Fairness Act that has some of the other tentacles of anti-harassment compliance. So a big deadline coming up October 1, 2020, Oregon employers must implement and disseminate a compliant policy. Of course, compliant policy is a specific term because there is very specific content requirements for the policy. It has to include state-specific content to Oregon. And so all employers there must have the policy, must implement the policy, and all employees in Oregon must receive the policy. And so there's a lot of specifics there. If it's an Oregon employer with which you're working, you'll want to make sure that they have this on their radar. And I just want to put a fine point on it to say that I know a lot of organizations have anti-harassment policies as a part of their handbook or employee guidebook, whatever they're calling it, or posted on the internet. And the difference here is that we need to make sure that it's a compliant policy, that it has these specific requirements or meets these specific requirements. Otherwise, you know, it wouldn't qualify as meeting the mandate. All right, so I'd like to provide a little bit of information about what we think is coming up next or what to watch. And so New Jersey is very much on the cusp of being the next state to have a training mandate. Back in February, there was a lot of press about it. The law is on Governor Phil Murphy's desk waiting to be signed. The governor has indicated he will sign this legislation into law. It has not yet happened, but you know, it's sort of an any day now scenario. It was end of February, and so right before the world was changed due to COVID, this was something that we were expecting, you know, to happen imminently. So what it does is strengthens an already existing New Jersey anti-harassment law, but it's a really thoughtful law, and that came about as a result of a 2-year study that was done by the New Jersey Department of Civil Rights. And so it has components to it that are familiar from the other requirements, training for anti-harassment and anti-discrimination to all employees. There's also policy and reporting requirements also being proposed here. So it's definitely something to watch and be mindful of if you have employers in New Jersey, because this is, by all accounts, likely to be the next state with a anti-harassment mandate. So a lot of states have pending legislation, and this is a sort of you know, crystal ball moment, because it's really hard to say what will happen next. I mean, a lot of these states have had multiple bills come to the floor, the state legislature, since the Me Too movement, sometimes 2 and 3 at a time, or in the pipeline, that have, you know, varying different degrees of requirements, and they fail or they die on the floor, and then new ones pop up. And so I think this is just a good slide to show that, you know, it's not sort of red state, blue state, it's across the board. Lots of different states are considering, and even those states like California and New York or Connecticut that already have training mandates or anti-harassment compliance mandates have additional proposals in the pipeline. And so this is definitely something that you can't sleep on and really need to make sure that you're continually staying up to date on, you know, which new states are coming on the scene, and then also which ones are updating the current laws that they have. This is an interesting look from my perspective. Oftentimes I'm asked by clients, what is the, like, what's next? what's coming for us? And so, you know, again, without a crystal ball, I think that you're sort of reading the tea leaves of who might be the next, which state might be next. This is a public agency list of the states that have anti-harassment training requirements for their public sector employees. And so the state legislature themselves are subjected to training requirements in these states. So, you know, one could say that perhaps having to go through the training themselves may or may not make it, you know, more likely that they would pass a law, knowing that the training is, you know, poignant and meaningful, but again, very difficult to say. Another question that I get asked a lot is whether or not there will be a, you know, federal law that will sort of set all of the different, because there's just so many different moving parts and pieces to these laws, and really hard, in particular, if you're an employer that has employees in multiple states, to try to keep all of it straight, even if you're just dealing with one state, because those states continue to update the laws. It's really challenging. And so I don't know that there's an answer for it. There is a federal Be Heard Act that has been proposed. It requires the adoption of a policy, training, some of the other mandates that we've seen. It requires employees participate in climate surveys. I haven't seen it get a ton of traction. I'm not sure that this is going to be the one that makes it into law, but it is something at least that's sort of going around from our federal government, and may be an opportunity at some point for there to be a national law so that there's a bit of level setting in terms of the requirements. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about how this compliance, how we fit this compliance piece into the culture. So, you know, I think you are all well aware of Me Too and the impact that it had. The workforce, I think, now is much more receptive to, again, thinking about that bystander intervention, feeling like there's a role for all of us to play. Even if I sit in my chair and think I would never harass one of my colleagues, that doesn't mean it's not happening to my colleagues from somebody else. And so everybody really taking action within the harassment prevention space, and making sure that that's being communicated, that that's the expectation, that you can't just look the other way. I think that we also need to be thoughtful about how the remote workforce and how folks working from home increases the risks of certain types of sexual harassment, which is something we're seeing a lot of now. I think I alluded to it earlier, but we really do have a different set of issues now with organizations that have, you know, group chats or utilize things like Slack, where there's a sort of free-flowing conversation amongst a group of folks, and sometimes it's very large groups, and things are being said and articles are being posted, and you know, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for employers to have an increased exposure to harassment claims, because it's really hard to manage, and sort of by design, those platforms are, you know, not to be managed. It's an outlet and an opportunity for collaboration and sort of, you know, free flowing of ideas. But that also, I think, brings with it a lot of issues. So, you know, definitely something outside of just the compliance mandate that you want to think about recommending to an employer, because training is one way that we can remind our employees of what the expectations are, and sort of have it be a part of the conversation in their day-to-day lives as an employee of the organization, rather than just like, oh, something they have to do once a year. And so I think it's a really constructive way to engage employees, and certainly something that is not it's not foolproof, right? It's not the only thing we do and then we don't talk about it. It has to be a part of some of the larger pieces, including policy mandates and including posters and some of the other pieces, but definitely a sort of intersection from a compliance and culture perspective. When we think about what, from a cultural perspective, the impact that these trainings and these posters and these policies can have, we want to think about how the trainings themselves can be integrated to the workplace culture. And so having it come as a tone from the top, the C-suite supports this initiative or this training, but then also that the managers sort of lean into their role in communicating what the expectations are. And again, having it be a part of the everyday practice. And so I think, without diving deep into an individual organization's culture, you want to think about training, ethics, brand tie-in. Accountability is really important, but nothing is as important as patience, because it really does take time to be thoughtful about how to meet these compliance mandates, but also then how to incorporate them into the workplace in a way that the message is adopted by the entire workforce. So just as a final note, keeping that communication going, thinking of it not just as annual training, but a discussion that can stem from the annual training requirement, but bringing it up in manager meetings, having when there's a, when we used to do annual meetings or offsites or, those types of opportunities to talk about both, how are things going and successes, and also how can we improve, what can be done to, to the extent that there are still issues from a harassment perspective, what can we do to help solve them? I think that policies are also taking a greater role in this, both from an employer reliance perspective, but also for having, being mandated, but also then utilizing them as a tool for employees so that they know not only what's acceptable conduct, but also what is expected, and also how you can fix an issue that you're having, whether it's due to reporting or the internal investigatory structure. And so, I think employee handbooks kind of, everyone's like, oh, it's such a beast of a project, and they maybe get a bad name in the HR world, but they really are super important. Not only that you have them to the extent they're required, but also that you are, utilizing them properly and keeping them updated. Really important. So no longer a silent partner there. So I just wanted to provide a couple of slides talking about these policies and where the mandates are. If you look at the left side of this particular slide, these are the policies that are required, the states that have a policy requirement. You'll see a couple of asterisks. In Illinois, the industries that are required to have a policy are limited to the bar and restaurant industries. So the Illinois law does not require employers outside of those two industries to have a policy. But I certainly think it's a best practice, as we've discussed. Massachusetts and Rhode Island do have those thresholds for number of employees for that policy requirement to kick in. You'll note on the right-hand side, policy recommended has a list of states that are, for various reasons, have either through committee notes or case law or other public positions have said that, we recommend that employers have a policy. Certainly to the extent that you are on the list of recommended, it is very much recommended as a best practice to have that policy. The states like Tennessee, for example, has specifically stated that if an employee or employer in Tennessee has an issue where an employee brings a claim, if the employer has a policy that sets forth the culture and expectation that there will be a harassment-free workplace, that the employer can use that as a part of their defense. And so certainly would like to encourage any employer to have a policy setting for the expectations. Again, you'll see Oregon on both sides of the columns because their policy requirement does not take effect until October 1st, but because we're so close to that, we're including it in both sides. And the list of states on this slide have policy-specific content requirements. So as if it's not enough to require the policy itself, these states have specific content requirements that need to be a part of the policy in order for them to meet the mandate. So I know that was a ton of information. I wanted to just switch gears quickly and hand it over to my friend Josh for a couple of slides.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Jill?
I can.
All right, just double checking there. Okay, just want to take a brief minute and remind you or introduce you to some of the elements, some of the ways and solutions that Viventium has to help with all kinds of HR compliance types of issues. And so if we can go to the next slide here, and I think maybe go 2 slides forward. There we go. So with HR Support Center, we have got a lot of content, a lot of widgets and tools that are available to you. I wanted to highlight a couple of pieces of content that we've received a lot of feedback as being uniquely helpful, specifically over the past 4, 5, 6 months with the challenges of 2020. So this is one that we did a few months ago. This is a return to work checklist. And specifically, as we've seen employers wherever they were in the process, whether they were beginning to anticipate reopening or they're in the middle of it, wherever you were, I think it became evident there were a lot of considerations to reopening a business after a prolonged shutdown or reduction in operations. And so this is a return to work checklist that's meant to make those considerations, to centralize them into one resource to give you kind of a guiding source to assess where you are there. So return to work checklist has been very popular. The next piece is, there we go. It's a quick start guide, deciding who to recall from furlough or layoff. I think as we navigated, or as employers navigated the complexities of the unfortunate situations with layoffs and furloughs and everything like that in response to COVID-19, there then became a moment where employers realized that recalling has a lot of sticky considerations to it. There's discrimination considerations. There's just all kinds of issues there that many, if not most employers, haven't ever had to face. And so this is a detailed piece that goes into those considerations. And we have had a lot of really good feedback on this piece being uniquely helpful. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. One other element is Viventium. If you are needing more situational solutions or help or attention from an HR expert, we have solutions for you there as well. So if you are interested in learning more about the HR solutions, the HR resources that Viventium has to offer, we encourage you to check out the HR resource services section in the website, or reach out to your Viventium representative, and we would be very happy to help you out with that. So let's see, I think that was it. Let's go to the next slide. All right, yeah, so we can leave it here and let's check time. It looks like we have a few minutes, and we had one question come in, but then I also know we've got some questions that I know, Jill, you just, you kind of anticipate based on as many businesses as you've delivered this to, several FAQs that just come up. So glad we have a little bit of time to dive into those.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. I did take a look at the question that was asked, and this is a complex one. So the question was, we have a few employees who only work in New York City a couple of days per month. Also, everyone, including these employees, have to be trained to California's harassment prevention and bystander standards. Are we okay? Do we need to ask these employees to complete additional training for New York City? Of course, there is not a straightforward answer. But I will tell you, because it involves tracking the employee and the amount of time that they actually spend in New York, because the New York City law actually says explicitly that any employees who work or will work in New York City for more than 80 hours in a calendar year and for at least 90 days must be trained regardless of whether or not they are based in New York City. And so, that's the technical complicated answer. I think to the extent that you have employees who are in New York City a couple of days a month, from an administrative perspective, trying to track and manage, I think would be really challenging. So I would suggest that, they are trained, because, you don't want to be in a situation where they sort of go over that threshold at some point and you miss it, and then there's some exposure there. So I'll go through a couple of the more frequently asked questions, and then if there's time, we can definitely dive into any of the other questions that we might have here. This is sort of on the same topic, but if our company only has one employee in California, does the California mandate apply to that one employee? And the answer is yes. One of the things that we didn't spend a ton of time on related to the Illinois law as well is that there's a component of that law that says that anybody who, even if they're not in Illinois, but regularly works with Illinois employees, needs to be trained on the Illinois law. So you sit in Ohio, but you work on projects with somebody in Chicago, you need to be trained by the Illinois law. So it's the only state that has a requirement, but it, I think logically makes sense that if you're working with the folks in Illinois, you want to make sure that everybody understands what the expectations are and requirements are of working in that state or with people who are based there. But I think it also bolsters the argument that there really is at this point the expectation that there's some measure of communication or training being offered by an employer for anti-harassment in the workplace. And so there's no sort of technicality that you can get out of unless you're in Delaware, which does have that 50 Delaware-based employee threshold in order to meet the mandates in that state. All right, moving on to question 2. What happens if some employees fail to take the training despite an employer's best efforts to make it available and to require everyone to take it? I get asked this question a lot because I think it really is one of the most challenging components, because you can, make available a state-of-the-art training and you can post the policy and you can make sure you have all of the content requirement, but it is really, really difficult to get employees to complete the training, do so within a particular time frame. And again, complete the training being the magical word, because just starting the training isn't sufficient, of course. And so what's the loophole? What's the silver bullet for an employer in the event that, in spite of their best efforts, they cannot get a certain handful of employees to take the training? And unfortunately, there isn't one. Every single state requires that all employees take the training, and that's what they mean, all employees. I think that there's a lot of historical baggage of, we offered the training in the spring and certain people were absent that day and certain people were on leave that day, and they'll just catch it the next time around. And that is not going to do it, and will certainly run into issues to the extent that there are individual issues with that employee, or you are audited by one of the state enforcement agencies to make sure that you're complying with the state mandate. So I wish I had a better answer, but I think it's really important that we're impressing upon employers that there just really isn't any way around it. And so finding a resource in a way that you can easily keep track of who's taken it, who still needs to take it, and deploying email reminders and those types of things can be really powerful, because everybody, when they say all employees, they mean it. All right, question number 3. Does the employer have to provide paid time for this training? Do I have to pay my employees to take this required training? And the answer is yes. And so if they are an exempt employee, they receive a salary, they can, sort of the expectation is that they take the training when they can. Non-exempt employees, it's a little bit more difficult when you have an hourly individual, particularly if they are in an industry or a workplace where they're not sitting at a computer all day. And so it's not something that I can just send you an email and remind you to go on the platform and take the training. And so really need to be creative about that, but definitely also mindful that that time needs to be compensated so that you aren't adding wage and hour liability or compliance issues on top of, trying to solve for one issue while creating another. Question number 4, is annually the calendar year or the employee anniversary? And, just because it seems like every opportunity to make things more complicated with these laws, they make them more complicated. It is the employee's anniversary. So whether that's anniversary of date of hire or anniversary of, taking it within that 90 days or 6-month window, or anniversary of promotion. And so I think I mentioned this before, that a lot of companies want to have this like, great, on April 1st of every year, we will deploy the training, and that's when they'll need to take it. And you just want to be really intentional about making sure that that's not the blanket approach, and that for people who are promoted, if they need to receive the additional training, for new hires, that they get caught up, that pulled into the training buckets and receive the training as needed. So event-based training for the states with compliance mandates is a thing of the past. And so having a resource that would allow for that type of revolving training offering is really become imperative. All right. So I don't know, Josh, if there are any other questions. Happy to hang out if there are a few.
Let's see. I think you may have already touched on it, but I did send you over one more. I don't know if it's complete overlap.
Okay, so the question is, my company completed the training for 2019 and we are less than 15. So do we have to do it again this year in New York City? And the answer is yes. And okay. Josh, you can attest, I never just give an answer.
Right. Well, good deal. Well, hey, thank you so much, Jill, for all of that information. Thank you, everybody that joined us today. And again, if you're interested in further resources, HR and compliance resources that Viventium has to help you out, visit the website or check in with your Viventium representative. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll give you, it looks like 5 minutes back, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.